What happens when one man controls more money than the U.S. Treasury? When a single banker can decide whether America's economy survives or collapses overnight? This isn't a scene from a movie, it's a true story. At the turn of the 20th century, one name held more power than Washington itself: J.P. Morgan. He didn't just run a bank, he was the bank. When presidents panicked, they called him. When markets crashed, he stepped in, not out of charity, but because the government had no one else strong enough to stop the bleeding. And the craziest part? He didn't hold an office, command an army, or win an election. He ruled through money. Quietly, absolutely, and for decades. But how did a private banker rise to a point where the U.S. government became the one asking him for help? That's the story we're about to uncover, one that shows how wealth, influence, and fear can merge into a single, unstoppable force. By the late 1800s, America was growing faster than any nation on Earth. Railroads stretched from coast to coast, factories smoked across the skyline, and new fortunes were made almost overnight. But underneath that booming progress was chaos. The young American economy was unstable, its banking system a patchwork of fragile local lenders, and the federal government lacked the tools to control it. In 1893, the country was hit with one of the worst financial crashes in its history. Banks closed their doors, railroads went bankrupt, gold, the backbone of the U.S. dollar, was bleeding out of the Treasury. Confidence vanished. Crowds formed outside banks, desperate to withdraw savings before the doors shut forever. And at the center of it all stood one man who seemed untouchable: John Pierpont Morgan. Morgan wasn't a politician, but his power was undeniable. He was a towering figure, literally and financially, known for his piercing eyes, his temper, and his absolute control over men of money. While Washington argued and panicked, Morgan was calm. He knew something no one else did. The government needed him more than he needed the government. In early 1895, President Grover Cleveland sent for him. The Treasury's gold reserves had fallen below $9 million, a dangerously low level for a global superpower. If the gold standard collapsed, America's currency, credibility, and economy would all go with it. Congress was paralyzed, and the markets were on the verge of rebellion. Morgan arrived at the White House like a king called to rescue a crumbling realm. He proposed a plan so bold it sounded insane. He would personally arrange a syndicate of New York and European bankers to supply $62 million worth of gold to the U.S. Treasury. In exchange, the government would issue special bonds that only Morgan's group could sell. It was a deal born of desperation. Cleveland agreed, and overnight, Morgan's name became synonymous with national salvation. The gold crisis ended, not because of Congress, not because of law or policy, but because a private banker had stepped in and done what an entire government could not. But this rescue came at a price. Morgan and his partners profited massively from the bond sales, and more importantly, they earned something far more valuable than money: influence. From that day on, Wall Street and Washington were no longer separate worlds. They were connected by one man's handshake. Then came 1907. The markets once again spiraled into panic. Banks failed, depositors rioted, and the economy teetered on collapse. There was still no Federal Reserve, no safety net, and no coordinated government response. The president, Theodore Roosevelt, could only watch. Once again, it was J.P. Morgan who took charge. He summoned the nation's top bankers to his massive Madison Avenue library, a dark oak-paneled fortress of wealth and power. As the story goes, Morgan locked the doors and refused to let anyone leave until a rescue plan was in place. Under the dim light of oil lamps, America's richest men pooled millions of dollars to save the banking system. It worked. Morgan's money and his authority stopped the financial collapse in its tracks. He had done it again: saved the nation, restored confidence, and proven that when America was in trouble, the first number they dialed wasn't the White House, it was J.P. Morgan. But behind the praise and newspaper headlines, critics were terrified. If one banker could stabilize the nation twice, what else could he do? Could he also manipulate the market, control industries, decide which companies lived or died? Those questions haunted Washington. And while politicians debated how to regulate men like Morgan, he was already moving on, using his newfound power to quietly merge, buy, and dominate the industries that would define the American century. Because for J.P. Morgan, saving the country wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of an empire, one built not on votes, but on balance sheets. After 1907, J.P. Morgan wasn't just a banker anymore. He was a kingmaker. He had proven that he could move markets, command presidents, and decide the fate of entire economies. And with the nation now indebted to him, he began building something far greater than a financial firm. He started constructing an empire. Morgan understood that power didn't come from money alone. It came from control. Control over steel, railroads, electricity, and the arteries of modern America. He didn't need to run factories or rail lines himself. He only needed to control the men who did. At the dawn of the 20th century, America's industries were a battlefield. Dozens of tycoons, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, fought viciously for dominance. But Morgan saw the chaos differently. To him, competition was inefficient. It was messy, emotional, unpredictable. He preferred order, and his version of order was simple. One giant company, run by him, with everyone else either absorbed or destroyed. So he began buying up competitors. Railroads that once fought each other for routes suddenly found themselves merged under Morgan's command. In a few short years, he controlled nearly 1/6 of the entire U.S. railroad system, more than 125,000 miles of track. And he wasn't done. In 1901, he set his sights on Andrew Carnegie, the only man whose wealth and ego could rival his own. Carnegie had built the largest steel company in the world, and Morgan wanted it. He arranged a secret meeting with Charles Schwab, Carnegie's trusted lieutenant, and offered an unprecedented deal. He would buy Carnegie steel outright for a staggering $480 million, equivalent to over $15 billion today. When the deal closed, Morgan combined Carnegie's empire with dozens of smaller firms, forming U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. In that moment, J.P. Morgan didn't just dominate an industry, he redefined capitalism itself. No one had ever imagined a company so big, so powerful, that it could influence the prices of steel across the globe. Reporters called him the Napoleon of Wall Street. Politicians whispered that he was more powerful than the president, and to an extent, they were right. His network of banks, companies, and boardrooms created what newspapers dubbed the money trust, a circle of financiers who could steer the entire American economy with a few quiet phone calls. But this new empire came with enemies. Ordinary Americans saw monopolies tightening their grip, prices rising, and small businesses crushed. The public began to fear that democracy itself was at risk, not from a foreign power, but from a handful of unelected men sitting in smoky boardrooms in New York. Still, Morgan didn't flinch. He believed he was bringing stability to a chaotic system, that he was the adult in a room full of reckless dreamers. To him, the country needed strong men to keep it running. And for a while, that illusion worked. His empire stretched across steel, rail, shipping, finance, and energy, a private web that reached every corner of the nation. But power like that never goes unnoticed for long, because soon the U.S. government, embarrassed, alarmed, and increasingly resentful, would strike back. By the early 1910s, J.P. Morgan wasn't just shaping industries, he was shaping the country itself. His fingerprints were everywhere. Railroads, banks, power plants, shipping lines, steel mills. Every paycheck, every bridge, every piece of machinery seemed to trace back to his network. And that terrified Washington. Politicians began whispering a dangerous question. Had America become a democracy run by voters or a plutocracy run by bankers? For years, Morgan had operated behind closed doors, rarely speaking publicly, never giving interviews, and avoiding cameras. He didn't need fame, he had control. When Congress tried to regulate the markets, his lobbyists softened the blows. When presidents needed loans or stability, they turned to him in secret. Even foreign governments courted his approval. But by 1912, the pressure was building. Progressive reformers were calling for trust-busting, and Morgan's empire was the biggest target of all. The public demanded to know whether one man and his allies had hijacked the nation's economy. And so, Congress launched a formal investigation, the Pujo Committee hearings, aimed squarely at the money trust. For the first time in his life, J.P. Morgan was forced into the spotlight. The world watched as the most powerful man in finance sat before a panel of politicians who dared to challenge him. He looked massive and unflinching with his signature nose and commanding glare, a man used to being feared, not questioned. When asked if his influence was too great, Morgan gave an answer that stunned the room. "A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom." To Morgan, money wasn't about currency, it was about character. He believed that integrity and power went hand in hand, and he saw himself as the guardian of order in a reckless world. But to the American people, his words only confirmed their fears, that the economy was being run by men who played by their own rules. The hearings revealed just how vast Morgan's reach had become. Through complex webs of board memberships and interlocking companies, he and his associates controlled dozens of major banks, railroads, and industrial giants. Essentially, they could decide where credit flowed and where it didn't. It was financial power so deep, it functioned like a shadow government. The backlash was fierce. Newspapers painted Morgan as a symbol of greed. Politicians called for reforms, and out of that storm came something extraordinary: the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Ironically, the law that created the U.S. Central Bank was, in many ways, a response to the power of one man. The Federal Reserve was meant to prevent another 1907-style panic and to ensure that no single banker could ever again dictate the nation's fate. But behind closed doors, the irony was obvious. Morgan's influence didn't disappear. Many of the men shaping the Federal Reserve's foundation came straight from his world, men trained in his banks, molded by his methods. The system meant to limit his kind ended up being built in his image. By the time Morgan died in 1913, newspapers claimed he was worth $80 million, an enormous sum for the era. But when accountants finished the books, the real number shocked everyone. His fortune was just $68 million, less than people imagined, yet his influence had been worth far more than gold. He had proven a chilling truth, that you don't need to hold office to rule a nation, you just need to control its money. When J.P. Morgan died in 1913, America sighed in relief. The newspapers called it the end of an era, as if the man who once ruled Wall Street with an iron fist had taken his empire with him to the grave. But the truth was very different. Morgan's death didn't end his power, it institutionalized it. His firm, J.P. Morgan & Co., carried on under his protégés. These were men trained in his image, disciplined, ruthless, and unflinchingly loyal to the creed of control. They didn't need Morgan's name to wield his influence. They inherited something far more valuable: his network, his methods, and his reputation for being the last line of defense when governments failed. As decades passed, Morgan's firm became the quiet heartbeat of the American financial system. It financed the Allies during World War I, helped stabilize currencies in Europe, and advised the U.S. Treasury during every major crisis. When nations went broke, J.P. Morgan & Co. was often there, not as a savior, but as a creditor. The firm became a symbol of American capitalism itself, a private institution whose influence reached from Washington to London to Wall Street and back again. Even the Great Depression couldn't erase its power, only transform it. While thousands of banks collapsed, Morgan's survived. In 1933, the Glass-Steagall Act forced a split between investment and commercial banking, dividing the Morgan empire into J.P. Morgan & Co., commercial, and Morgan Stanley, investment. Yet even divided, the House of Morgan remained a cornerstone of global finance. It was too big to fail, even before that phrase existed. Fast forward nearly a century. After a series of mergers and transformations, Chase Manhattan, Chemical Bank, Manufacturers Hanover, the modern J.P. Morgan Chase emerged. Today it is the largest bank in the United States, managing over $4 trillion in assets and operating in more than 100 countries. Its balance sheet is bigger than the GDP of most nations. It influences interest rates, bond markets, and even governments' access to capital. When the U.S. economy shakes, J.P. Morgan feels it first. And when the world panics, its boardrooms often decide what happens next. In 2008, when the global financial crisis struck, history repeated itself. The government once again turned to J.P. Morgan for help. Under CEO Jamie Dimon, the bank absorbed collapsing giants like Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual, moves encouraged, even coordinated by federal officials. The echoes of 1907 were unmistakable. When panic hits, the state still leans on the same institution J.P. Morgan built. In recent years, J.P. Morgan has extended its reach even further. It's funding renewable energy, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and, most strategically, national defense supply chains. According to reports, the bank is investing billions into sectors labeled critical to U.S. national security. A private bank, once again, operating hand in hand with the government, and sometimes ahead of it. It raises an unsettling question. After more than a century, has J.P. Morgan's empire truly changed? Or has it simply evolved into something even larger? A global organism that no longer needs a single man to lead it. Because while Morgan's name rests in history books, his system still beats inside the world's largest financial institution. A system where stability and control walk hand in hand, and where the line between government and banker is as thin as it's ever been. Today, when you tap your card, take a loan, or check your savings, you're connected to a system that traces back to J.P. Morgan's world. A world built on confidence, control, and the quiet understanding that whoever controls the flow of money controls everything else. You might not see it. That's the beauty of it. The power isn't loud or visible. It doesn't need to be. It moves through interest rates, credit ratings, and digital transactions. It shapes which businesses rise, which governments borrow, and even which ideas get funded. More than a century ago, J.P. Morgan showed that money could do what politics couldn't: unify, stabilize, and dominate. And in doing so, he revealed a truth that still defines modern finance, that the world doesn't run on democracy or ideology. It runs on trust. Trust that the banks will hold. Trust that your money means something. Trust that the system won't break. But who earns that trust today? Is it governments? Or is it the institutions that have become too big to fail, too powerful to question, and too deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life to ever truly lose? Because while presidents come and go, J.P. Morgan remains. When the global economy trembles, it's their conference rooms that fill with world leaders, their balance sheets that shape the next bailout, their analysts who quietly brief governments on what comes next. It's not a conspiracy, it's continuity. A structure so vast and efficient that even nations depend on it to keep moving forward. And maybe that's the genius or the danger of what J.P. Morgan built. He didn't just create a bank. He created a template for power, one that could survive wars, crashes, and revolutions. A machine so well designed that it could outlive him and even outgrow the state itself. So, the next time a crisis hits and you hear about market confidence or financial stability, remember this. Those words were first defined by a man who once bailed out the United States with his own gold. A man who showed that sometimes governments don't lead, they follow. Because J.P. Morgan may be gone, but his question still echoes today. If money runs the world, then who really runs the money? A century ago, J.P. Morgan stood in his library with a single light burning and a nation waiting outside his doors. The country was terrified, the markets were collapsing, and every eye looked to him for salvation. He didn't hold office, he didn't wear a crown, but in that moment, he was the United States' last hope. And that's the paradox of power. When institutions fail, people turn to whoever can deliver results, even if that person isn't elected or accountable or part of the system at all. Morgan didn't seize control. He earned it because the government gave it to him. He built a legacy that outlived him, one that still defines the relationship between Wall Street and Washington. Every bailout, every emergency meeting, every headline about stabilizing markets, they all trace back to the template he created, a partnership between power and money so deep that it's impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. And maybe that's the real story here. Not how one man became more powerful than the U.S. government, but how the government never fully took that power back. So ask yourself this: when the next crisis comes, and it will come, who will save the system this time? The leaders you voted for, or the bankers you never see? Because if history has taught us anything, it's this: J.P. Morgan didn't just save America, he built the world we're all still living in.